My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 29 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at my family's annual 4th of July reunion in Traverse City, Michigan, my Aunt Patricia stood up in front of nearly 60 relatives and said, loud enough for the whole backyard to hear, that I wasn't even a real Whitfield, not by blood, and everyone in this family has known it for years. I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad, and I didn't say a single word back. I didn't need to, because 3 days earlier, a genetics lab in Ohio had already called me with results that were about to make my aunt's little speech the most embarrassing thing she'd said at a family gathering in 30 years. To understand why I stayed so calm, standing in that backyard with 60 pairs of eyes suddenly on me, you have to go back 4 months, to a random Tuesday night when I ordered a DNA kit off my couch for absolutely no dramatic reason at all. Before I get into it, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It really does help this story reach more people. Drop the word blood in the comments if you've ever had your place in a family questioned by someone who had no idea what they were actually questioning. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because this story starts somewhere a lot smaller than a backyard full of relatives. I've never worked in science, medicine, or anything close to genetics. I teach 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary in Grand Rapids, 40 minutes from where I grew up. My evenings mostly involve grading spelling tests and watching too much reality television, which is exactly what I was doing back in February when an ad for one of those mail-in Ancestry DNA kits popped up during a commercial break. I'd always been a little curious about my background. My dad's side, the Whitfields, are about as documented a family as you can get, generations of the same small towns in northern Michigan. But my mother's side was murkier, and she'd passed away when I was 22 without ever finishing the family tree she used to talk about building one day. I ordered the kit almost as a way of finishing something for her. I want to explain the family situation a little, because it matters for what happened later. I'm the only child of Walter Whitfield and his second wife, my mother Linda. Walter had been married once before, briefly in his 20s, to a woman named Carol, and that marriage produced my half-sister Patricia. Yes, the aunt from the reunion, though she's technically my half-sibling, not my aunt. A detail the family has always softened by calling her Aunt Patricia, since she's 22 years older than me and closer in age to my father than to me. Walter and Carol divorced before I was born. Walter married my mother a few years later, and I grew up as the much younger half-sister in a family where Patricia had already established herself, married, and had kids of her own by the time I hit kindergarten. I never felt like an outsider, not really, not until the last several years. My father passed away 6 years ago, and something about his absence seemed to loosen whatever had quietly held the family's tolerance of me together. Patricia had never been outright cruel before he died, but she'd always had this particular way of referring to the real Whitfields, in a tone that somehow never quite included me, even at Thanksgiving tables where I was sitting right there. My cousins, her kids, picked up the same habit without ever really examining it. Little comments about dad's side versus the second family, jokes about how I didn't really grow up a Whitfield the way we did, said with just enough humor wrapped around them that objecting always felt like overreacting. I let most of it go for years. My father had loved me plainly and completely, had walked me down the aisle at my wedding 4 years ago before things fell apart with my ex-husband, had called me his daughter in every single way that mattered his entire life. I didn't need Patricia's approval to know what I was to him. But approval and belonging are different things, and by the time that DNA kit ad popped up on my television in February, some small part of me, if I'm honest, was curious for reasons that went beyond finishing my mother's family tree. Some part of me wanted concrete proof of something I already knew emotionally, but had never had documented the way Patricia's side of the family always seemed to have documented everything about themselves. Old photo albums, family Bibles, a whole scrapbook Carol had kept of the original Whitfields that conveniently never included pictures of me. I sent off the sample in late February and mostly forgot about it, the way you forget about most things you order online during a boring Tuesday night. I didn't think about it again until a call came in on a Thursday afternoon in early June, while I was still at school finishing up end-of-year report cards, from a number I didn't recognize with an Ohio area code. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Dr. Renee Okafor, a genetic counselor with the lab I'd used, and she explained that she was calling personally rather than just emailing my results, because something in my report required what she called a bit of context before you read it on your own. I remember sitting in my classroom, red pen still in hand, feeling my stomach tighten in the specific way it does right before you're told something you didn't expect to be told. She explained the basics first, the parts I'd actually been curious about, my mother's side, the murky half of the family tree, traced back through a cluster of matches to a small farming community in western Pennsylvania. Distant cousins I'd never met, but whose names started filling in gaps my mother had never gotten the chance to close herself. That part made me cry a little, sitting at my desk after the last student had gone home for the day. Then she got to the part she'd actually called about. She explained that these ancestry databases work by matching your DNA against everyone else who's ever submitted a sample and opted into the shared matching pool. And that several years ago, apparently, a handful of Whitfield relatives had done exactly that, including, Dr. Okafor said carefully, my Aunt Patricia, who'd tested back in 2019 out of what the file notes described as a personal genealogy project. My paternal matches, she explained, confirmed conclusively what I'd never actually doubted emotionally, but had never had documented. I shared exactly the genetic markers you'd expect between a father and daughter with Walter Whitfield's known relatives, distant cousins 3 and 4 times removed who'd also tested, all tracing back cleanly through the same paternal Whitfield line that stretched back generations in northern Michigan. I was, genetically, completely and unambiguously a Whitfield. But, Dr. Okafor said, and I could hear her choosing her words slowly now, your file also cross-matched against Patricia's sample already in the system, since you're both listed under the same paternal surname line. And the sibling relationship markers between the two of you don't show what you'd expect for half-siblings sharing a father. They show what you'd expect between two people with no biological relationship on the paternal side at all. I asked her, a little stunned, what that meant exactly. It means, she said, that based on this data, Patricia doesn't appear to share Walter Whitfield as a biological father. Her paternal markers trace to a completely different lineage. I want to be clear, this isn't something I'm speculating about. This is what 2 independently submitted, verified samples show when compared directly. I sat in my empty classroom for a long time after that call ended. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it wasn't triumph, not in that first hour. It was something closer to vertigo, the strange, dizzying sensation of watching a story I'd absorbed my whole life, the story where Patricia was the real child and I was the complicated afterthought, simply not hold up against the data anymore. I didn't tell anyone right away. I sat with it for almost 3 weeks, the report saved in a folder on my laptop, not sure what, if anything, I was supposed to do with information like that. I want to be clear that I never intended to use it as a weapon. Genuinely. I thought for a while that I might just quietly keep it to myself, a strange private fact that changed nothing about how I felt toward my father's memory, or toward Patricia's kids, who I loved regardless of any of this. What changed my mind was the reunion. The 4th of July gathering happens every year at my uncle's lake house outside Traverse City. 60-some relatives spread across a backyard with a pig roast and too many coolers of lemonade. I almost didn't go this year, if I'm honest, because the last few reunions had left me feeling more like a guest at someone else's family than a Whitfield myself. I went anyway, mostly because my father used to love that lake house, and some part of me still goes for him. Patricia had clearly been building up to something for a while, based on how the day unfolded. She made a comment early on about how some people at this reunion actually earned their spot at this table, directed vaguely at the group but landing, everyone understood, on me. I let it go. Then, an hour later, standing near the dessert table with a paper plate of potato salad in my hand, she said it plainly, loud enough for the whole backyard to hear, the sentence I opened this story with, that I wasn't even a real Whitfield, not by blood, and everyone in the family had known it for years. I want to describe the silence that followed, because it wasn't the silence of everyone agreeing with her. It was the silence of 60 people suddenly unsure where to look. My cousin Danny told me later that his stomach dropped, not because he thought Patricia was right, but because he genuinely didn't know how I'd respond, and some old, uncomfortable family tension he'd absorbed as a kid finally had a moment out in the open air. I set my paper plate down on the dessert table. I said calmly, "Patricia, I actually have some information about that if you want to hear it." Patricia crossed her arms, half smiling in the way people do when they think they've already won an argument. "Go ahead, Nora, enlighten us." I told her, plainly and without raising my voice, about the DNA test I'd taken back in February, about Dr. Okafor's call, about the paternal markers that confirmed conclusively that I shared Walter Whitfield's genetic line with the same certainty as any of his other blood relatives. I watched her expression hold steady through that part, like she'd expected me to simply be confirming what she already believed, maybe assuming I was building towards some kind of emotional plea about how family isn't just blood. Then I told her the second part, that the same lab, cross-referencing her own sample from 2019, showed that her paternal markers didn't trace back to Walter Whitfield's lineage at all, that whatever the data showed about her actual biological father, it wasn't the man she'd spent her whole life calling Dad, the man whose name she'd just invoked in front of 60 people to draw a line I supposedly stood on the wrong side of. The backyard went completely silent. Not dramatic movie silent, real silent, the kind where you can hear the pig roast still crackling on the spit and somebody's dog barking 2 yards over. Patricia's smile didn't so much fall as just stop, frozen halfway between confidence and confusion. That's a mistake," she said. "The lab made an error. That happens all the time with these things. It's the same lab and the same database that just confirmed my relationship to every single one of Dad's cousins who've ever tested," I said. "If it's an error that somehow only shows up exactly where it would need to make everything Dad ever told me true, and everything you just said in front of everyone not true." My Uncle Gerald, Walter's younger brother, who'd been standing near the grill, walked over at that point, his face pale in a way I'd never seen on him before. He asked, quietly, whether I actually had the report with me, and when I pulled it up on my phone and handed it to him, I watched him read it with the specific stillness of someone doing math they didn't want to be doing in front of an audience. "Patricia," he said slowly, "does your mother know about this?" Patricia's face did something complicated then, and I understood, watching it happen, that this wasn't entirely news to her, that some version of doubt had probably existed in that family for a long time, quietly, the kind of thing nobody says out loud because saying it out loud makes it real, in a way that whispered suspicion never quite does. "This isn't the time," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You made it the time," I said, not unkindly but plainly. "You stood up in front of everyone and decided today was the day to question my place in this family. I'm not asking anyone to question yours. I'm just telling you what the same data you apparently trusted enough to submit back in 2019 actually says." I didn't stay much longer after that. I hugged my cousin Danny, said a quiet goodbye to my Uncle Gerald, and drove the 2 hours home with the windows down the whole way, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, more like the specific, quiet relief of finally setting down a question I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying my entire life. I found out through Danny, about a week later, that Patricia's mother, Carol, had in fact known for decades about a brief relationship she'd had before marrying my father, one that had overlapped with the early part of their marriage in a way she'd never disclosed to anyone, including, apparently, Patricia herself, who'd grown up completely unaware that the man she'd spent her whole life defending as her real father, against a half-sister 22 years younger, might not be her biological father at all. 5 weeks have passed since that reunion, and the family has been, understandably, a strange and quiet mess ever since. Carol confirmed, eventually, in a private conversation with Patricia that Danny told me about secondhand, that the brief relationship had happened, and that she'd made a choice decades ago never to disturb what she believed was a stable, happy family by raising a question she wasn't even sure needed raising. She apologized to Patricia, apparently, in a way that Danny described as more sad than sorry, the apology of someone who'd been carrying a private, complicated truth for so long that finally saying it out loud felt like relief and grief happening at the same time. Patricia hasn't spoken to me directly since the reunion. She sent one text about 2 weeks after everything happened that read simply, "I need some time. This wasn't about you, not really." I believe that, actually. I think for years, Patricia's insistence on being the real Whitfield wasn't really about excluding me. I think it was about a quiet, unspoken fear of her own. The fear of not quite belonging to the family she'd spent her whole life anchoring her identity to. I think some part of her always sensed something wasn't fully settled in her own story, and it was easier to point at me as the uncertain one than to sit with that uncertainty in herself. My Uncle Gerald has been the one constant through all of this. He called me twice in the weeks after the reunion, once just to check in, and once to tell me, plainly, that whatever the DNA said about anyone else in the family, it hadn't changed a single thing about how he saw me, that I'd been his brother's daughter since the day I was born, and no lab result was ever going to make that more or less true than it already was. I think he said it mostly for his own benefit as much as mine, a way of anchoring himself in the middle of a family story that had just quietly rearranged itself. I don't know what happens next with Patricia. Danny says she's struggling, that the kids have noticed something's wrong even though nobody's explained it to them directly, and that Carol and Patricia have barely spoken since the conversation Danny described to me. I don't take satisfaction in any of that. I didn't set out to unravel anyone's sense of who they are. I set out, back in February, to finish a family tree my mother never got to complete, and I ended up, completely by accident, holding a piece of information that finally answered a question I hadn't realized I'd spent my whole life quietly asking, and unintentionally raised a much harder one for someone else. I think about Patricia sometimes, and I don't feel any anger toward her anymore, even after that backyard. I think she spent decades needing to be the certain one, the real one, in a family where her own foundation may have always been a little less solid than she let herself believe, and I just happened to be standing nearby when that foundation finally came into view. I don't think that makes what she said to me at that reunion okay. I just think it makes it a little easier to understand. If you're watching this and someone has ever questioned whether you truly belong somewhere, in a family, in a room, in a life you built for yourself, I want you to hear this. Belonging was never actually theirs to decide. Sometimes the truth just needs a little time, and occasionally, a very ordinary DNA kit ordered on a boring Tuesday night to finally speak for itself. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time someone questioned where you belonged and what it felt like to finally know the truth for yourself. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman who spent her whole childhood being told she looked nothing like her family, and the photograph in her grandmother's attic that finally explained why.